When I arrived to Paro, we had a discussion that the Americans were the ones who tended to stand in front of audiences and have a very charismatic, assertive presence. And that there was some discussion this morning, actually, about the need for maybe the Americans to tone things down and to adjust to Bhutanese culture and be more, be quieter and less assertive. But Sir Dasho has shown me that indeed in Bhutanese culture, it is actually quite typical to stand in front of audiences and to walk around on the stage. So with apologies, I'll go ahead and follow Sir Dasho's lead and stand out here on the stage where it's much more comfortable for me instead of behind the podium. Let me just take the slide. So when they asked me to talk about human rights and climate change today, part of me was very excited. I was very happy. As the bio mentioned, my research focus deals with the intersection of indigenous rights, human rights, and environment. I've been doing quite a bit of case study analysis throughout Southeast Asia on this particular issue, and particularly in Myanmar. But another part of me was a little bit nervous because the topic of human rights and climate change is very broad. And you can spend your entire career on this one particular topic. And so as a result of that, what I do today is actually just exercise a bit of discretion. I have chosen to talk about one particular case study that is very close to my heart. And what you see there is a picture of Inle Lake in Myanmar. This is a lake that is in the land of my people. So I'm what's called a member of the Paro indigenous peoples. That's me in traditional dress that you see in the picture in the lower right-hand corner. That's the modern version of our traditional dress. Historically, we actually had much more significant turbans, right? And now, obviously, just like you, we have adjusted to the 21st century. We don't sit around campfires and hold hands and talk about nature all the time. We do wear modern dress. We do travel the world. We do study and get doctorates and PhDs, just like hopefully most of the students here will do in due course. So the story that I want to talk to you about is focusing on the issue or the topic of indigenous rights. And my motivation is about doing indigenous rights as opposed to just simply talking about indigenous rights. And I wanted to give you a cautionary warning that when we talk about doing indigenous rights, we have to distinguish between top-down approaches versus bottom-up approaches, right? So hence the word bottom-up approaches in my presentation. So the starting point of my conversation today regarding this story is that is the progress that's happened at the international level over the course of the past few years. And I think there's been a lot of commendable action at the global levels of discourse regarding climate change. So we see in spaces like the UN General Assembly, the UN Human Rights Council, in international environmental spaces like the UNFCCC, where they've talked about the need for greater attention to indigenous peoples, the vulnerability of indigenous cultures, and the role that indigenous peoples can play within climate change actions. So all of these kinds of efforts, I laud them. I think they're very positive, but I just note that they're top-down approaches. They're decisions being made at international levels, at international institutions, and then there's sort of this expectation that they'll then percolate down to the local levels. My concern is what the response is. So I've talked to a number of people about this over the course of the past few years, that there's this phenomenon of indigenous resistance. So that despite the fact that there's greater attention to indigenous issues and greater concerns for indigenous rights within international environmental law, we are still witnessing indigenous resistance. That there are indigenous peoples who are not satisfied, they're not happy, and in some cases they're actually opposing UNFCCC efforts, right? So when I look at the reasons or motivations for these, there are two areas. One is that there's a gap in terms of knowledge and knowledge production. So for the students in the room, there are these terms, ontology, epistemology. that there's a gap between indigenous understandings of the world, so ontology. There's a gap between indigenous modes of analysis or ways of looking at the world, so epistemology, compared to these global discourses. So the way indigenous peoples understand climate change, the way indigenous peoples understand the environment is not the same way that's occurring within global discourses. Another issue, and this is the one that I'm going to focus on for the rest of today, is the issue about decision making. Right? So in particular, there are two major factors that I've seen that indigenous peoples constantly talk about. One is that the participation at the global levels within international decision-making mechanisms, it's quite often performative, right? That indigenous peoples are expected to show up, they're expected to be tokens, they're expected to be silent, and they're expected to be there to legitimize pre-existing decisions, right? So we say that this is performative. It's not actually substantive, it's performative. The second issue is that there's a structure to the decision making, that there's a hegemony. That, what I mean by this is that when indigenous people show up to a decision making forum, they can provide input, they can provide comments, but the discretion to listen to the indigenous peoples, the discretion to adopt indigenous concerns is always held by an authority figure at the international or global level. Okay? So once again, performative but not substantive. All right? So how do we get around this? Okay? So how do we go about doing indigenous rights as opposed to talking about indigenous rights? So what I'm advocating for in the story that I'm telling you is about bottom-up, okay, a bottom-up approach. So in my situation, the indigenous peoples that are in Shan State, they're represented around Inle Lake. So Inle Lake is a freshwater body near the mountains of Shan State. It's mountainous, similar to Bhutan, not quite the same altitude. This area is known for its ethnic or cultural diversity. Around the lake itself, there are at least 16 different indigenous cultures that all coexist. They all share the concerns that are common to so many indigenous peoples with respect to the environment. They have a desire for self-determination. They want autonomy. They want control. What is it they want control over? Well, separate from politics or law, there's also a very strong interest in cultural survival. They want to protect their own culture. They want to protect their identity. Part of the culture, part of the identity is traditional lands. They want control over traditional lands. They want control over natural resources. And so as a result of this, the story or the narrative then is that they want bottom up, right? They want local control. They want local autonomy. And this is a situation where we then get a bit of a conflict between these top-down approaches. Right. Next. Due to the political situation in Myanmar right now, I cannot use actual names, okay? I cannot show you actual faces. So what I've done here is provide photos that cover people's faces. Everyone is masked. I'm also using a pseudonym for the organization itself. So the Inlay Professional Women's Association, or IPWA, this is an association primarily of indigenous women around Inle Lake. They're primarily entrepreneurs, so they're all engaged in women's businesses. They have come together as an association as a matter of solidarity, knowledge sharing, but most importantly, income generation. They're trying to help indigenous women become sources of income for their local communities. On top of this, they're also trying to advance gender rights. They're trying to promote the role of women within their historical patriarchal societies. So there are activities that they do out of this. There's the business training, primarily around textiles, primarily around agriculture, but then there's also environmental activities. So they're very aware of the changes in the environment that are happening around the lake. They're very aware of the changes in climate that are happening as well. And they're also very aware of the public health consequences that are happening. Because as the environment changes around the lake, the quality of the water in the lake changes. If the quality of the water in the lake changes, it affects the health of the local community. Right? So these are all things that they're involved with. All right. I'm not going to go through this entire slide. I'm just simply doing a screen dump of all my data for those of you who are academics out there. Instead, what I'll just simply point out to you as part of the story is that the core of this organization was a group of women who had already had advanced training with major donor organizations. In particular, some of them had actually worked for the World Bank at certain points in time. Others had worked for the International Finance Corporation, or the IFC. They actually started the organization with an initial seed funding from both entities. But then here's the most interesting thing, and this is where it ties into the story of bottom-up approaches. They were actually offered more than $2 million in international donor funding, and they rejected it, right? They told me that they refused to get any further international funding. Now, I asked them, why is this happening? Why? This actually sent shockwaves through several embassies in Yangon, and I was trying to find out, well, what had happened? And so the story, or the explanation that they told me was that they want gender rights. They want to promote environmental conservation. They want to be consistent with international norms, but they also want to do it in a way that's compliant or consistent with their own local cultures, right? They want to be culturally sensitive. And they felt that with international donor funding, that they had to comply with global agendas. They had to give up control to offices that were located in Washington, D.C., London, or Rome, and that as a result of that, they would no longer have the ability to make local decisions. So for this is incredibly problematic. And given the choice between having lots of money, but with global control, versus having very little money, but more local control, then they decided they'd go with little money and more local control, right? So that's effectively the decision they've made. Now, the consequences of this for the discussions about governance, the nature of human rights, the nature of doing human rights or doing indigenous rights, there are several different layers to this that I pull out. All right, so these are the lessons that I drew out from their experiences. Number one, against the international agendas. They're actually willing to exercise local agency. They're actually willing to exercise autonomy. They're actually willing to go ahead and express a freedom to decide, right? So they are able to go, they're not resisting, because remember, they want international norms. It's a question of how you do it. So they want to have international norms, but they want to do it their way, right? So this is what's going on. So they don't want the aid, but they do want the norms. Domestically, all right? Again, local control. That means they're also in the process of resisting the status quo authoritarian system that exists inside Myanmar. They have the courage to do it, all right? We're talking about wisdom, compassion, and courage. They have the courage to do it, but they also have the wisdom to be very resourceful and creative in how they do it, and they're trying to preserve the space for themselves to exercise that kind of wisdom and resourcefulness. The third thing I'll mention here is about their own cultures. Now, this is something that has not been discussed today. I'm not sure if it will be discussed in the rest of the few days. When we talk about culture, indigenous cultures, local cultures, I think we all understand, but we never talk about the fact that cultures change, right? So we say we want to respect culture, but that doesn't necessarily mean we want everything to be the same all the time. When we say that we're trying to respect culture, what we're really trying to say is that we're trying to respect people's ability to choose, right? We respect the people's ability to decide their own culture. So that's really what's happening here. In the case of these women, they respected their own cultures, they were very proud of their cultures, but yet they were also trying to change their own cultures. They were trying to change the patriarchy. But again, the key thing is, how do you do it, right? They didn't want someone in Washington, D.C., London, or Rome to decide how to do it. They wanted to decide how to do it. All right, so that was the lesson that I pulled out of this. All right, so my final slide, and I'll try to finish on time. I apologize for this, is, what do we mean by how do we do bottom-up approaches? How do we get around this? Okay, so a lot of human rights and climate change is tied to development aid patterns, particularly in developing countries. Quite often, the way things work is that you have an international system that has an international agenda of some kind. There is an international donor with lots of money that says, wow, these international norms are great. These international agendas are wonderful. I've got the money. I just need to find someone to do it. Right? So the international donor takes the money. They find an international aid provider. They give the money to the international aid provider to then go to a developing country to then provide capacity building, right? To provide training, these kinds of things. What I looked at the story of this association and what these women were doing, I realized that we didn't need those middle steps, right? These women were doing it on their own. They knew what they were doing. They know how to do it. So what the question that this raises for me, and the provocation, I think, for the international system to think about is, can we remove that middle step? And can we find a way that we just simply are an international community that is enabling local actors, right? That we don't have to work through donors, we don't have to work through international aid providers. Is there a way that we can support local communities themselves to go ahead and advance their own agendas, right? So that's the thing, that's the last message I'll finish off with here. I do want to extend thanks to the JSW Law School for inviting me. I'm very humbled. Hopefully this story was very valuable for you. I'll also want to thank the women in this association. Full disclosure, the reason I had access to these indigenous communities and the reason I had access to this indigenous association, they all grew up with my brother, right? They all knew my mom and my aunts. So as a result of that, they were actually willing to talk to me, right? They were willing to talk to a man. They were willing to talk to a Western educated man because they thought I was one of them, right? So I have to say, I have to give my thanks to them, right? So I'll finish there. Thank you.